Hi folks, we're carrying on here with sanding. So a common question that I get in the classroom, especially from second year students, is they're not really sure where they should start as far as grit levels. Well, that will depend on whether it's veneer or if it's solid wood. Typically for solid wood, I would recommend starting at an 80 grit. There's going to be dents, there's going to be scratches, there's going to be nicks, and we need to get that out of there. So we do that with fairly aggressively right off up front, and so I'll hit that with an 80 grit. The second pass I might throw on 100 grit, and depending on the material that I'm sanding, whether it's an open pore wood, typically on open pore wood I would not sand any higher than maybe a 150 grit at the high end. Most of that oaks and ash I would finish off at maybe a 120 grit. And if it's veneer, I don't start any lower than 100 grit. 80 grit's a little bit aggressive. You don't have a lot of veneer on that panel to start with. So 100 grit will remove that rough surface to clean that up. And again, depending on the type of material is, whether it's cherry, oak, or maple, or walnut, the level that you sand to is going to be directly related to the finish color that you're trying to achieve. The higher the grit level that you go to, the less stain penetration you get. So if it's cherry and maple, I tend to want to finish off my sanding at maybe a 150 grit. Some people like to take it to 180. I think that's very restrictive for your stain penetration, but that's just personal choice. The level that you go to will have a direct impact on what the finished color will be on your project. And one thing that you should never do, and you want to pay attention to when you're working on this machinery, is you should never jump any more than 2 levels in your grits. So if you start with an 80 grit, the next level that you sand to should be maybe a 120. You should not jump from an 80 to a 150, because the 150 grit is not aggressive enough to clean up the scratch pattern of an 80 grit. So I think we'll just skip through this one, Laurie, and we'll go right on to the next one. And normally sand with the grain, that's pretty much common sense. Some designs force cross grain. Yeah, sometimes that happens. We have to deal with that, especially when we're doing cabinet doors and stuff. In a case like that, I tend to go one level higher on the sanding. Instead of finishing at a 150 grit, I might go to a 180 grit. If I have to do cross grain sanding, it's typically we would take that to one level higher in order for the stain to balance out. Too fine a sanding will result in less sandpaper life and improper sanding. So you can start sanding at too high of a level, and all you're really doing is eating up and burning up the sandpaper. Maybe forward through there again for me, please. So, techniques of sanding. For hand sanding, we use block sanding, utilization of sandpaper. We have a sanding devil. You can use a crepe block and stuff for cleaning up your sandpaper to get a little bit more life out of it. Direction, face, end, edge grain, and profiles. All of these factors are going to make a difference in what type of sandpaper you're working with, what level you're working with. If you're doing face grain or end grain, you need to be a little bit more aggressive. Profiles, we want to typically use a lighter grade backing so that it will flex a little bit better. The blocks that we use, depending on the type of surface that you're sanding, if you want a firm or a hard block, if you're trying to maintain a square edge on a piece, then you're going to want a hard block. If you don't mind a slight right radius, then you go to a softer block. Portable power tools, there's lots of portable power tools. I've got palm sanders in my shop, I've got an orbital sander, I've got a portable belt sander. They all have specific applications. I don't always want to pull out a big machine and to work on that. Sometimes it makes more sense just to pull out a belt sander or an orbital sander to get the job done. As far as stationary sanding machines, we have edge sanders. We have two different edge sanders available to us in the shop. We have stroke sanders. We've got wide belt sanders available to us in the shop, and we have profile sander, such as a drum sander, spindle sander, and we also actually have a profile sander that we use for sanding profiles when we need to. There is specialty tools, I'm going to talk about them more next year, that's available that can be installed on a CNC router, and they are specifically for sanding profiles. I'll be talking more about that in next year's class. The thing you have to remember when you're sanding is use the right grit for the job and let the grit do the work. It doesn't necessarily take a lot of pressure. You don't have to be really aggressive in order to do a good job of sanding. But if you have the right grit on the machine, it will do a great job for you. And a couple things to touch on. I'm going to maybe come back to this slide if we can. Laurie, just move forward one more. Now, I have a couple of pieces here. This is a pad off of a stroke sander. That pad is made up of three different components. One is we have a solid block to give us a flat surface. The second thing in here is we have a layer of felt, and then we have a layer of graphite. And every sanding machine, whether it's a stroke sander, a portable belt sander, a wide belt sander, will have those three main components. So this is your graphite. This is what a new pad of graphite looks like. And the purpose of that graphite is to lubricate the surface, and it also draws heat away from your pressure points. If you can reduce the heat, you reduce the burning, you do a better job of sanding. The felt pad, it's there for cushion. And it's not a normal felt, it's what they call a dense felt. And that is actually manufactured in Waterloo. And we buy this stuff by a 4x8 sheet, and then we cut it to fit the machines. And you can get this stuff in a lot of different thicknesses. We happen to buy 1/4 inch material, and we can just cut this up with a knife, or we just nip it on the bandsaw actually. And we cut this and install it and upgrade our sanding pads every year with that. Okay, so let's just maybe stop there for a second.